Podcast. Welcome everybody. We're just going to give it another 2 minutes or so to let people log in and we'll get started. But thank you for joining us this evening.
Great. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone. We have a huge turnout tonight. It's so great to have you all with us. My name's Sarah Muncie, and I'm one of the co-founders of Neighborhood Villages, along with Lauren Kennedy. Neighborhood Villages was founded to fix the childcare crisis. We envision a world in which all families have access to affordable, high-quality childcare. In service of this vision, we advocate for childcare sector reform and operate community-based programs that provide immediate solutions for families in the greater Boston area. And before we go any further, we want to say that Black Lives Matter. Black parents deserve to expect the world to see and value the best of their child's authentic self. Childcare is an issue of equity and of social justice, and lack of access to affordable childcare in this country is too often tied to zip code, which is too often tied to race. The time to fix childcare is now, and an equitable childcare system is truly within our reach. We are so excited that so many of you are joining us tonight, and we hope that you will join us in the future in this movement. So a few housekeeping items before we start. Our discussion today will be in webinar mode. So you'll only be seeing video of our panelists and everyone will be muted by the host. However, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and you can see who else is joined if you click participants. We'll be saving for Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please enter your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. I want to thank the host committee for helping us to get so many folks interested in tonight's discussion. We're here to discuss the broken childcare market and how it has failed families, especially women. The goal of this call is to raise awareness on the issue and to identify opportunities for engagement, particularly at the advocacy and political level. Our panelists tonight. Congresswoman Katherine Clark proudly serves the 5th District of Massachusetts. Since 2018, she's been serving as vice chair of the Democratic Caucus, making her the 6th highest ranking Democrat in the 116th Congress. Katherine's career in public service is driven by her commitment to helping children and families succeed. She's long been a vocal advocate for ending wage discrimination, protecting women's health care, access to affordable, high-quality childcare, and for paid family leave. In Congress, she brings her experience as a state senator, state representative, and general counsel for the Massachusetts Office of Child Care Services. We're also joined tonight by Boston City Councilor Andrea Campbell. Councilor Campbell represents District 4 of Boston, which includes the neighborhoods of Dorchester and Mattapan, as well as parts of Rosendale and Jamaica Plain. In 2018, she was unanimously elected Boston City Council President by her colleagues and is the first African-American woman to serve in this role. Councilor Campbell is a champion on issues of public safety and criminal justice, affordable housing, and racial equity initiatives. And she created the first ever dedicated line item in the city's budget to specifically fund youth development programming and youth service organizations. I am so proud that we have these two incredible women joining us tonight. And I am also proud to hand it over to my brilliant colleague, Lauren Kennedy.
Thank you. And thank you again to our fabulous panelists and to everyone who's joining us this evening. Just quickly before we launch into the panel here, I just want to reiterate that this conversation tonight is off the record and closed to press. So if you are a member of the media, we welcome you to stay online here and join us for the conversation. But what's discussed here tonight is off the record. So diving right in, I think, you know, as we would all agree on this panel, and probably many of the people tuning in tonight are aware that the childcare sector in the United States and here in Massachusetts was very unstable, even in the best of times, and for probably time immemorial, has been failing to meet the childcare needs of families, and particularly women. So to begin the dialogue, I wanted to ask both of you to give us an overview of, in the aftermath of the pandemic, as we start to move into recovery and into whatever the new normal will be, what is the current state of the childcare sector nationally and here in Massachusetts? And what will it take to make sure childcare is even an option when women and families return to work? And Representative Clark, I was hoping we could start with you, as you've been leading efforts in Congress to stabilize the childcare sector. Can you give us an overview of what's needed and what the future looks like if we don't make an investment in this sector?
Oh, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here with everyone, especially with Lauren and Sarah and all the good people at Neighborhood Villages for the work you do and your advocacy. And it is always a true pleasure to be anywhere, even virtually, with Councilor Campbell. Just really excited for this conversation. And unfortunately, like so many things, this pandemic has revealed some stark realities that we knew existed, but it has magnified them. And one of them is childcare. And childcare is very interwoven to what we are going through, a painful period in this country of looking at race relations, looking at police brutality in an unblinking way, and trying to come to terms with the very, very deep and toxic roots of slavery that impacts every single part of our communities. And childcare is one of them. Childcare, we know, is one of the best public investments that we can make. For every dollar that we invest, we get at minimum $4 back. And some of the estimates and data are much, much higher. But it is a predominantly woman-run industry. 92 to 95% of all childcare providers and staff are women, and 40 to 45% of those women are women of color. And therefore, childcare, I don't think it is too startling to draw a straight line between that and the fact that childcare is often disregarded as the crucial underpinning of our economy and instead becomes an afterthought, something that is thought of as a personal decision for families. And we're very uneasy with the role of government and the need for investment. But in my opinion, this is as crucial public good and infrastructure as our roads and our bridges, as broadband, as making sure that we are connected. And the payoff is great, not only for the children, the educational opportunities, the ability to make sure that every child hits kindergarten ready to learn, and that they meet that crucial milestone of reading at grade level by 3rd grade. We know that if children hit that milestone, everything changes for them as they go from learning how to read to using reading to learn. And childcare can be a crucial part of that, especially for low-income children. But it has very low wages for providers. We know that most family childcare providers and even most centers operate at the very thinnest of margins in good times. And it has very high costs for consumers and parents and families. And so as a result, we have an industry that was in crisis going into this pandemic. And now we have to make sure that we are making the long overdue investments. And frankly, a lot of that will always be in partnership with our local communities, nonprofits, and states. But the federal government needs to step up at this time. We are the entity that can support, that can run a deficit. And if we want to rebuild our economy, and if we want to make sure that it is inclusive, and we want to make sure that we are taking those values and ideals of liberty and equality and justice and applying them not just to our criminal justice system, but to our system of education and to small women-owned, women of color-owned businesses, and make sure that we are closing the gender gap in wages, we have to focus on childcare. And we're in a situation where I am afraid we could lose so much capacity that we just have childcare providers who do not have those existing relationships with financial institutions. We know they've had a very difficult time accessing the PPP program. And so now is the time for the federal government to step up, help support cities and states and nonprofits, and make sure that this sector not only survives, but is reimagined and thrives as we move forward. And I truly appreciate your partnership in all of this and look forward to all the questions that we're going to talk about tonight.
Great. And then handing it over to you, Councilor Campbell, if you could share with us what the landscape is looking like in your district here in Massachusetts, what you're hearing from your constituents, particularly against this, context of how do we build a more equitable and just Massachusetts and America as we move forward. What's the expected impact of the pandemic? What has been families' experience to date? I think the ground level view here, the importance of it can't be understated. And we thank you for how you've been a champion of this, and love to hear your thoughts on.
No, thank you, Lauren and Sarah, of course, and Neighborhood Villages for the opportunity to participate. It's truly an honor to sort of be on, to be on the panel with our Congresswoman Clark, who of course I have followed her career for a long time and admire the work she does, not just in the education space with respect to this important and critical issue, but so many other issues. So it's an honor to be on the panel with her. And of course, thank you to the participants who have joined us this evening. And I saw some folks in the chat, including, Amy O'Leary and many others who have been doing incredible work and advocating for these issues for a really long time. So appreciate the panelists, the participants also joining us. I think obviously the Congresswoman has been working on these issues longer than I've been elected, and summed up sort of every piece. But if I could sort of take it down to that ground level and let you know what I'm seeing in my district, what I'm hearing from constituents, of course, with respect to this issue. I want to start with, I appreciate the grounding of this issue, not only in education, and educational inequities, but also connecting it to race relations, the history of slavery in this country, the foundation of this country that devalued Black residents and Black people as less than human compared to their white counterparts. That foundation connects and is shows up in every inequity that we see, in every system inequity that we see in this country. So it's important to connect the dots, and I appreciate the intentionality here to do just that. And folks who are participating, if you don't, you make a mistake, right? You sort of talk about the picture in one way, but you don't complete the story, which in terms of lack of access, lack of quality care, particularly for communities of color, residents of color. And then of course, looking at who are the providers. If you do not connect it to the conversation around race, you won't know that it's connected to women, of course, and people of color who are really holding this system together to meet the needs of our families. So I appreciate that intentionality. So on the ground, this has been a major issue even before COVID-19. And with whether it is health inequities, educational inequities in terms of our remote learning opportunities right now, or public safety issues, police brutality, criminal justice reform, and criminal justice system, all the inequities in all of these systems, our economy is showing up in our early ed and care system. And so even before COVID-19, I was lucky to serve with colleagues and women counselors who got it, right? Not just Congresswoman Presley, but Councilor Anissa Asabi-George, Councilor Wu, all of us actually took on this issue early on in our careers as counselors, and we did a series. Actually, it was the first time that the women came together to specifically focus on one issue, and this was the issue. And what were we talking about years ago? We were talking about the lack of quality and access in particular neighborhoods in Boston, namely Dorchester, Roxbury, and East Boston, where actually now I just checked the recent data, almost 47% of our 4-year-olds live. We were talking not just about the lack of access and quality, we were talking about the cost, how expensive childcare is in Massachusetts compared to other states across the country, and how we are at the top. We were talking about flexibility. How do we support those workers who are in construction jobs, who work the night shift, our essential workers, as we would describe them today, who also need access, but who are often not a part of the conversation when it comes to the flexibility. We're also talking about the wages, the economics of running a daycare, and not only how much folks were being paid and how low those wages were, but the capital that was needed to run an effective program, the hurdles and the barriers in the licensing process at the state level. So we had a range of topics that we talked about then, and now those have just continued to be relevant, but now are more relevant than ever before, because now everyone else is getting it, right? That this is not only critical to women electeds, to women as sort of the heads of our households in many ways, it's critical to our economy. You know, you can't talk about a reopening conversation, sustainability, how we come back, how we recover if you don't talk about childcare. My constituents are, on the one hand, really, and I'll be very frank, I often say I don't speak in code, really disappointed and upset at not being more at the table with respect to these conversations around reopening. You know, I've been having conversations with providers who are, one, concerned about the recent regulations out of the EEC with respect to how they will reopen, how they're supposed to reopen, how do you physically distance toddlers, and how do you have enough resources to buy all the things that are necessary to protect your staff, to protect the children? They feel as though they weren't at the table. And so we keep pushing the governor and many others to say, you need to be on the ground talking to the providers. Otherwise, these providers will never come back. Just like every other business, they will close. And then, of course, that will have a ripple effect on the economy. From the residents' perspective, those who require childcare, and I am one of those. I'm a mother of 2. I have a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old. And as my husband and I are both in conversations about what it looks like for us to physically return to work, it is shocking to me how many employers are saying, oh, come on back, and haven't figured this piece out. So constituents are really concerned as to what they're going to do when it comes to placing their child in a daycare facility or some facility when their regular provider isn't available. And I'll be even more frank, are really disappointed to hear some of our leaders suggest that they try a stranger. You know, you build up relationships, you go through a long process, you visit, you talk to other parents, you make sure that whatever provider you choose, it is the best fit for your family. So it's easy to just say, why don't you look elsewhere? That is incredibly hard for families. But I think the silver lining in all of this is that we have a unique opportunity, similar to how we have a conversation right now with respect to policing reform, and that sense of urgency is there. It's sad that it took George Floyd's murder for some people to get it. But right now we have an opportunity to do critical investments in this, on this issue, to support our providers with immediate capital. There's some funding opportunities at the City of Boston. What does it mean to expand that? I, for years, have been saying in the education context, let's hire someone at the city level who's at the cabinet level to specifically focus on this issue, and not to frame it as 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, but birth to 5 years old. We all know it starts with 0 to 5, and every step of the way is a crucial development point for children. But right now, if you're a parent, how do you know how to navigate that? So we could hire someone to specifically focus on this issue, who's the point person to make sure that we are putting out in a public way all of the resources that are available to our families. Right now, you have to navigate various systems to be able to understand what is available to you in the city of Boston, what is available to you in greater Boston. And then in addition to this person owning the issue and being the point person and mapping the resources, this person can also be responsible for being creative, right? Connecting with all of our hospitals, our nonprofits, our schools, our individuals, the private sector, to really think about how do we close the gap in terms of access? How do we expand quality for every family? How do we support those providers, particularly women and providers of color, in making sure they are resourced appropriately to be able to thrive? And lastly, how do we make sure that every single parent understands not only the importance of this, of care, but has access to it? And right now, there's some creative things that we could be doing, and I look forward to answering questions about that. But excited to talk about more of this issue and how we work together as a collective to change the conversation and to get to work to dismantling these inequities with respect to this critical issue.
Great, thank you. So I think both of you have raised the immediate and immense need that we're looking at, and particularly for communities who have, again, sort of long, right, been underserved with respect to childcare options, affordable options, high quality options. And now as we look to the impact that COVID-19 has had on our childcare sector and the barriers, the sort of uphill climb that many providers will be asked to journey as they reopen and look towards recovery, that those communities may very well, right, take a harder hit than others. And so I'm wondering, what is it that you need from us? Who you have on this call tonight, and folks are starting to introduce themselves on the chat. It was not a gender exclusive call whatsoever, but we did target this to a community of women who have had access to childcare as a sort of passion item on their list for a long time, or those who may be coming to the issue for the first time because it has become so immediate. Sorry. I'm just going to keep saying immediate tonight because it's the end of the day, and my vocabulary is becoming more limited as we go along. It's become so prevalent and so obvious that we will not only fail to jumpstart our economy if we don't fix childcare, but we're also going to leave communities behind altogether and lock them out of economic recovery, and that we can expect a disproportionate impact on women. And so tonight, given the audience you have, what is it that you need from us? What is it that we're facing in Congress right now? What are we facing in Massachusetts? And what are the different strategies for how this community could lend its political capital to back you up on the different, whether it's the bills that you've been championing, Congresswoman Clark, in Congress, and I think we'd love to hear about those, both your work with the CARES Act and the HEROES Act, and then the Child Care is Essentials Act. What's the insider perspective? What are the new strategies, the new messages that we should be deploying? Because this is a very engaged audience looking for ways, again, to throw their weight behind this and fix it, a long overdue problem that needs to be fixed now.
Well, that is a great offer. And on this call, there are just so many community leaders and healthcare leaders and educators. It is a great opportunity for us to think about how we move forward. And, something that Andrea said is we have to act with the urgency, and we also have to act for the long run. We cannot do what we have done so many times in the past, which is say, we passed a bill. There was money for childcare in the CARES Act. We're going to pass a policing reform act and then move on from the issue. So we need you all to sign up for the long haul, but we also need to talk about childcare in a way that we have evolved in Massachusetts far more than I see across the nation, that we understand that childcare fundamentally is early education. That is at the crux of it. And as Andrea said, this starts with our infants and exposure to rich language, making sure that there is good nutrition and healthcare and that they're meeting developmental milestones. All of this is part of nurturing resilient, beautiful children. And it's critical. And it is critical, especially for low-income children. We know that growing up in poverty is traumatizing, even to very young children, and that childcare, quality childcare, can be a powerful tool for overcoming that and equalizing the playing field for all kids. And so we have to start talking about childcare not as simply a private decision, but as one that helps our economy at the most fundamental levels. And we have to, I think, look at it as infrastructure and make sure that we understand that it is as interwoven as all these other issues, but that if we are supporting working parents, if we are supporting parents of all income levels having access to quality childcare, that is a game changer, not only for those children and families, but for the communities around them. I recently read a study that a group called Civitas, which is out of Linfield, did of childcare providers in New Jersey applying for the PPP program. And what was really heartbreaking were women of color providers, especially in low-income communities, who did not even see that they were running successful businesses. They did not even think of it that way because that was never the feedback. It was always like, oh, you're a daycare provider, you are a babysitter. So we have to change the way that we acknowledge the role of these providers, and that this is critical care and early education for children, but it is also so meaningful to employers. And we know that it is absolutely essential for retaining and attracting a workforce. It is as meaningful as when the trains run and when, the traffic and commuting for decisions people make in staying in the workforce. And so we want to make sure that we think about it and talk about it at those levels. And on the federal level, we have money in the CARES Act. There is another $7 billion that is in the HEROES Act that the Senate has not taken up yet. Included also in the HEROES Act is funding for municipalities and state governments, which are key partners. And if we starve them, we're never going to be able to fix so many of the problems that this pandemic has exposed. But we need the Senate to act on that, but it's a small deposit on what we need to do. And the bill that I've been working on in Congress would propose $100 billion with a B in money that will help providers restructure, that will help parents afford a quality care, and that makes the type of investments we just haven't done. We're also going to be rolling out a student loan program so that we are investing in our childcare providers. I had a town hall in Cambridge, and there were a group of childcare providers and early educators who came, all of whom were living in public housing, because even though they're working full-time, they still weren't making enough money in those jobs to be able to support their families. You know, we just devalue this work, and we need to increase the wages, but give the type of support so that all of that just doesn't get passed on to parents in higher tuition that they can't afford. And coming out of this pandemic, for so many families, they don't have that financial reserve to even know if they're going to be able to hold a spot in a childcare, never mind people who are worried about less subsidies and less slots being available for their children, as we try and incorporate safe measures to keep everyone healthy, but that are going to put more stress on the budgets of providers and have less seats potentially available for parents. So it's about investing and helping people renovate. I had a provider in Dorchester who talked about she would like to add a vestibule to her house so she could take temperatures and check in with families before they came into her home where her children lived and all the other children that she's caring for. We should help her with that. These are the type of things that we want to make sure that everybody is healthy going forward, but we can't do it and say, well, we're going to put in these requirements, we are not going to help. So just when parents and providers have no resources to address these changes, we're just going to let them figure it out on their own. Now is the time for this investment that's long overdue. This childcare crisis didn't come on just in the pandemic, but it has been exacerbated. And so we're looking for big money. I'm going to continue to push for my See Campus bill, which is about making sure that our parent students have a safe place to go. Going to Bay State Community College in my district and seeing, you know, beautiful little kids, but in the library with their snacks in plastic bags, just waiting for their parents, because all of those programs have been cut from federal funding, and there simply isn't a place for parents to go who are trying to further their education and be able to provide for their families. So we've got a lot of work to do. I think we can do some innovative things, but we really need everyone on this call's help in changing the way we talk about childcare and recognizing how essential this work is to not only addressing this pandemic and reopening our economy, but to really building that inclusive economy that we want to build for all our communities to benefit from.
Thank you. And Andrea, I want to offer that same question to you. Again, what's it going to take? What is resonating most closely with the constituents, with the small business owners, with the community leaders, with whom you work? What is it going to take at the city level, or as, you know, sort of Boston has its relationship with the larger state of Massachusetts? What do you need to see from us, and how can we, you know, stand in solidarity with the community voices that are stepping forward on this issue?
Well, I'll start with, you know, we've been naming the problem in many respects. And there first has to be a willingness to say, we're not going back to the status quo. And not just with respect to early ed care and focusing on 0 to 5, but the educational system as a whole. For far too long, specifically in Boston, but we could talk about other municipalities across the Commonwealth, school districts have been failing communities and communities of color, right? I put this in quotes, a success story coming out of Boston Public Schools. I'm proud of the experience I had in BPS, and I say that all the time. And my experience goes back to, you know, early ed all the way through 12th grade, of course, and an incredible experience. But I know that not to be true, not only for my twin brother who died while in the custody of Department of Correction at the age of 29, but along with so many other folks in my community and other folks I grew up with and now the constituents I serve. So there has to be explicit, we have to say explicitly and boldly, we're not going back. We're not going back to a system that continues to not value the providers who are running this economy in so many ways to ensure that our children are safe, are learning, are meeting their milestones, so that when they get to the 3rd grade, or when they get to the 2nd grade, or when they get to the 1st grade, right, that they're not behind. We are not going to go back to undervaluing them in such a way that we don't pay them the wages they deserve or give them the benefits they deserve. And so I think that, for me, is number one. Once we decide to be bold and courageous, there's a lot of things we can do. One, we can, of course, support our Congresswoman and our federal delegation to say, please, yes, we need a federal bailout specifically for these providers, specifically for this industry. And if we could do it for banks, if we could do it for other institutions, it must be done for this sector. Everyone is dependent on the federal government doing something. So all of us, of course, can be supporting what's happening there. But, you know, I'm an optimistic person, and I look at what's coming out of Washington, and there's some days it's hard to be optimistic. So I do think at the local level, at the state level, there are some creative things we could be doing. And so for folks specifically on the call, one, we talk about these providers, they're businesses, right? These are folks running successful businesses who are struggling right now. So outside of making sure that they have immediate capital, so in the midst of COVID-19, I've had some incredible women leaders step up and come into my district to specifically support women-owned businesses that have repurposed to meet the needs of our constituents in terms of PPE, and said, you know what, I'm going to give this woman immediate capital, not only to sustain through COVID-19, but to thrive coming out of it. The same intentionality needs to exist for our providers. Where are providers? We have a sense of where they are. We could find them, particularly in communities of color, in certain neighborhoods in Boston. We need to be very intentional of starting in certain neighborhoods, because that's where the inequities are. And if we apply that equity lens and that focus on certain areas, we could say, let's give them immediate capital. What businesses need it right now to stay afloat, to come back online? In addition to sort of the dollars, technical assistance. This is, I think, an incredible time to be supporting businesses that are struggling with their paperwork, right? I'll put that in quotes. If you need a lawyer, right, to really sort of cross your T's, dot your I's. If you're struggling to go through the new regulations and to understand them. If you don't speak English as a first language and you need supports, there are practical things that all of us could be doing in terms of the technical assistance piece. And I have to, Tanya Del Rio is on the call from the Office of Women Advancement in the city of Boston. And she's been doing some incredible work here, but of course she can't do it alone. But a great point person to help us identify those providers that need immediate technical assistance. And all of us could do that, right, on a pro bono basis, whether as an individual, or if you have an institution or a law firm, or you run some kind of program that helps businesses thrive and grow. Technical assistance absolutely needed. In addition, I wrote down some notes. I firmly believe, not just sort of in naming the problem, but putting forth solutions. I spent almost 6 months with a whole range of stakeholders working on, I call it Action for Boston Children, a plan that specifically looks at 4 key areas to help move our education system in a different direction, to begin to close opportunity and achievement gaps, to help expand access to quality schools in every neighborhood in the city of Boston, and to, of course, ensure that every parent, every family has access to incredible, high quality, accessible too, right, in their neighborhood, high quality, accessible early care providers. That there were sort of 4 pillars, and this early ed piece was critical. In every conversation I had with anyone who cares about education, everyone said we have to do something in this area. And I was blessed to work with so many experts who said we can come forth with concrete things. So in my action plan, and I call it action because I'm like, I'm done wasting time, let's move on this. I was asking folks to really put forward specific actionable things we can do. So that point person that described that the city could hire to really own this, critical, and not someone who's, you know, the chief of education owning a whole bunch of things. No, owning specifically this, 0 to 5, own that piece. We get that right. Can you imagine what our data later with respect to opportunity and achievement gaps looks like? Obviously, I think it would get better if we invested at the front end. Someone can own that. The continuum, how do we map all of the resources that exist in the city of Boston, in greater Boston, in the Commonwealth? There are a lot of resources in our hospital settings, nonprofits, at our city level, within our family providers, a lot of resources that folks either don't know about, they live in different spaces. We could map that in such a way that you go to one site, one website, one place, and all of that is readily available to you in layman terms, plain English, and in any language that you need. So that when you are pregnant, you know through resources on this website, for example, that you have to read to your child now. Or how do you connect with a network of folks? All of us take for granted the networks of parents we are connected to say, what did you do? My kid is in this terrible twos. What did you do? Help me. How do you create even network resources on a website that is accessible to families? So I'm telling folks, action for Boston children. I think my team is somewhere on this call. Read the report, but that piece, we need your support to push on in the city of Boston. It hasn't happened. And I refuse to let this report gather dust on the shelf. But another piece I think is critical is we often, of course, want government to solve our problems. Yes, government absolutely has to play a role. We're talking about public goods here. But we know, at least in communities of color, it can take government a really long time to get to our needs. So we have to think creatively and outside the box on what the community offers as solutions to these problems. There are a lot of effective solutions out there that we maybe need to adopt in government to resource, to sustain, and make available to other community members. So for example, I live in Mattapan. And right now there's conversation around who, what grandmother or who might be available to provide childcare that is trusted in the community while we wait for our childcare providers to come back online. That's creative solutions from community, from the grassroots up. And I really think we have to create a space where some of those solutions can bubble to the top as a way to complement what we do in government. And complement it, not replace it, but work sort of hand in hand. Because these community solutions might be the best. And some of the leaders currently that are doing our child care provider work are probably the best people in the lead. So again, important to have them at the table and a part of the solution.
Great, and I couldn't agree more with everything you have both said, but certainly that last point about who's at the table and whose voices are being heard, and making sure that we have providers leading the discussion, community leaders leading the discussion, because this is, as you both have put it, as neighborhood villages, let's just shout from the mountaintops. Birth to 5 programming, early education, childcare, whatever you want to call it, is a public good. It's a public good for children, and it's a public good / public necessity for parents who are trying to go to work. And have I'm going to steal this from Justin Pasquarello from the East Boston Social Centers, because it was his term that he coined, but to be able to parent joyfully, right? This isn't just about I'm going to work and therefore childcare. It's childcare and work and balance and joyful family life and joyful parenting. So given that this is a public good, but knowing that in addition to government, and government both sort of creating architecture, government providing the funding, that those who inform the policymaking, those who inform the architecture are the providers and also the parents. And I think that sort of leads me to my last question here, and then we wanted to save a little bit of time for question and answer. But when it comes to putting parents, families, women at the forefront of the conversation here and really elevating their voices, can you speak a little bit to what is the impact that I would say we can expect we're going to feel as women, particularly women of color, and how as women do we band together and again really maximize our political capital, perhaps in a way that we haven't been for a while, but now maybe have sort of been jump started to focus on the issue and really to put it on the priority list. So I say, coming up in this world, I was sort of on the understanding that I should have autonomy over my body and my reproductive choices, that I deserved a place in the workforce, that I deserve to be paid the same amount as my male peers. Now we know we have a lot of work to do on that, but at least there's an expectation, and that I should expect, or at least fight for, paid family medical leave. And yet childcare somehow wasn't part of that kind of priority list that for myself as a young woman was expecting. And so I think this is, sort of an open-ended question, but what would you sort of like to see again from this community? How do we put parents and women at the forefront of the conversation? And what would be sort of the most compelling call to action from, your vantage point, Congresswoman, and also from yours, Councilor? And I leave that to the two of you. So
Why don't you start, Andrea? I've been like babbling on.
No. So, I'm mindful of time too, and in Q&A. Right now I'm looking at, the policing reform that we're talking about. That is at the top of the list. That is what is taking over the media. And every chance I get, I've been telling folks, that's not the only system that's been failing women and people of color. There are a lot of systems that we need to be talking about all at the same time, including health inequities and, of course, childcare right now. So I think in putting forth solutions and ideas, one place to start is to sort of look around at our own tables and say, who's there and who isn't? I'm always saying, even if I'm excellent, I can always do better. And so in many of the education conversations I was having early on, I had to ask myself, who is here and who isn't? There's one thing to have experts, of course, who've been doing this work for a long time, but if they are all white, or if they're all women, if they all are African-American, right? If they're not, Latino, like Latinx, like given what our demographics are in terms of who the providers are, who's at the table? And so I really want to think critically, and I don't have all the answers on how we organize. How do we get people taking to the streets like we have right now for police reform on education issues generally? This is one piece, but I am like waiting for my constituents to look around and go, wait a minute, this education system is failing me too. I'm going to start marching, right? And I'm not going to stop marching until we get reforms like we're beginning to see in the policing context. And so as we're pushing this sense of urgency, I think there's a way to continue that momentum and to get people sort of marching for equity here on this critical issue. And of course, inviting them to our tables where we're making decisions around what technical assistance should look like for them. What does an infusion of capital look like? For some, they may say it's not actually money that I need, it's something else. What is that, right? I think I'm looking forward to more conversations with providers where we are listening to them in a more intimate way, or I am, to really get at what their solutions are and to consistently have them at the table, not as an afterthought, but as regular practice. And of course, mobilizing all of them along with us to not let this issue go.
Yeah, and I would just add and emphasize that we have to start demanding not only that their work is valued, that the work of women of color are equally valued and seen as part of a critical education system and economic support, but that we march, we protest, and we vote like our lives depend on it, because they do. And we have an opportunity here to rethink and reprioritize and see these connections. And it's not going to be comfortable. It's not comfortable to look at racism and institutional bias. It's not easy, but we have to start in our own spheres and look around our offices, look around our organizations. Childcare tends to have a lot of women involved who look like me. More my age, white women. And it's not that we don't have something to offer, but it is like any organization, if we are aiming for equity, We have to start within our offices, within who we are inviting, whose voices are we listening to. I always like what Ayana says, if there's no room at the table, well, then we'll build a chair and add on to it. And that's what we have to do. And we have to vote. And we have to vote for people who understand how interwoven these issues are, and that childcare just isn't something for working moms who are putting careers ahead of families, that this is an opportunity to really understand how our economy works and how it doesn't work for way too many of us. And that it begins at the very youngest time for children. You know, so many families in this country don't even have the opportunity or the choice to just have one job. It's a series of jobs and arrangements to make the economy work for them. So we can do our part by making sure, as Andrea has said, being very intentional about who's at the table, who we're listening to. The federal government is very good at funding, but we are also a few steps removed from the local needs. And so I think one of the challenges is to make sure that we get this funding, we get this investment, that we act urgently, but that we also make sure that we're leaving it as flexible as possible so that local communities can come together and roadmap what their needs are, where they feel things have been neglected, how they would like to expand. And so I think that we have to keep those things in mind and not put things in silos and say, you know, George Floyd's death is over here and that's about that, and see how these things all are interconnected and keep our intention. I think Karen Spilka had a quote today, this is going to be both a sprint and a marathon. And that's exactly right. We have to sprint towards the urgency of funding and meeting this need so that the childcare sector doesn't disappear before our eyes and further cut off communities that so need this care and early education, and parents who need a safe, affordable, quality place so they can go to work, and employers who need those workers to be able to show up and to be confident that their children are well cared for while they are there. And we need to look at very different schedules for different workers. There are many different essential workers, and we have to look at our system and build in those accommodations. So I remember sitting in a meeting many years ago, and I was one of two women and the only mom at the time who had kids in childcare. And the discussion was whether subsidized children should be able to have a subsidy for more than 8 hours a day for the workday. And wouldn't it make more sense? Wouldn't it be better for children developmentally if they were not in childcare for over 8 hours a day? And I sort of looked around the table and everyone's like, that probably makes a lot of sense. Like, how are you supposed to get to work and back to pick up your children and work at least an 8-hour day if your subsidy doesn't cover that time? I mean, so we have to think about, sometimes, you know, the policy has to meet reality, and that's going to be different for different communities. So it's about the funding, it's about the flexibility, and it's about making this a priority and seeing the connections, and make sure that come the fall, we're voting for people who are going to vote for us and vote for women and vote for people of color, and make sure that our children each have the opportunity that we want for all of our kids. And this is a way to deliver that to children. And, you know, one of my hopes is that when we come through this, that children of color will walk through the world with all the same assumptions of security that my children and Lauren's children and Sarah's children walk through the world. We want that for Andrea's children and every child. And having great quality, affordable childcare is a great way to start.
Right, thank you. So we, I think, have time maybe for one or two questions. Sorry, I did not do a very good job moderating our panel discussion. But
We
if
were
our
hard to
panelists have
stop.
1 or 2 extra minutes maybe to stay over, I'm gonna hand it off to Sarah just to field a question or two from the Q&A.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who has put questions in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question from Corey, who asked, do you have any suggestions for how we can get out the vote, particularly in the early education community, to help our voices be heard? So who'd like to take that one?
Well, I think all of our campaigning and getting out the vote is going to be very different this year. But there are ways to organize, and there are organizations like Neighborhood Villages that are conveners of parents. And I think we have to start by looking at who are the groups who are already doing great work and convening people. Many of our labor unions, it's their members who are the moms and dads who really depend on childcare. And so I think we have to look at the existing organizations and make sure that we are tapping in, and not only making sure that, parents of young children who really understand this need and providers are registered and voting on this issue, but that people understand in a far broader context the importance of this to educating all of our kids and making sure that we have a robust economy here that includes everyone. And so I think it's a great thing to focus on with this issue, because, make sure you bring it up at every local debate. Ask people the question, what's your stand? And how do you see this connected to all the other issues of racial justice that we are tackling right now?
Great.
Sarah, I'll just add, in mobilizing folks around the issue around voting, of course, get out and vote. Thinking outside of just childcare providers and education organizations, a lot of our providers, for example, are immigrants, right? With an immigrant background. Critical issue, let's connect those dots. How do we work with immigrant advocacy organizations and those doing that work to say, this issue connects to childcare, critically important, get out to vote, exercise your power in that way. So thinking about other organizations that, of course, allies in this work.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, and I'd love to start with you, Andrea. So this is from Grace, and she said, do you think the COVID crisis offers an opportunity to get men aware of and on board with the need for childcare in a different way? And if so, how can we harness that momentum? I'm feeling
yes,
this.
yes, and yes. My husband, has been going back and forth with his job. Every call that I am on, as people are looking at, how we transition from this virtual world to in person, the number one issue that's coming up, not just for women, but for the men, whether as an employer, as an employee, is childcare. And so I was just on a call this morning. The Speaker of the House, Speaker DeLeo, was the speaker of the panel. He was the main event, and he was talking about, of course, this critical issue and more investment and how we need to do more with respect to the economy. So everyone is owning this issue, which again is why this is such an incredible time to push the envelope, right, on what we can accomplish and pull in more allies than we could ever imagine to move this forward. I mean, we obviously got it, that it wasn't just a woman issue, right? It's great to see now other people are getting it, but it's an opportunity because everyone is talking about this, because it's now affecting them in a more personal way.
Yeah, and just to briefly add what Andrea said, I think one of the things I found heartening is how many chambers of commerce I've heard from who are saying this is a barrier. And we have actually, there's a history of the business community being a little ahead of policymakers because they understand this, they see it play out every day. But it has been heartening to see that Boston Chamber of Commerce identified it as one of their top 3 barriers, and that has held true across the country and across my district. And we're going to be doing some work with the National Chamber of Commerce, which is a rather unusual political partner for me, but they understand that this issue is critical. So I think that we have a real opportunity to appeal to folks who may not have put the pieces together before and show how critical this is going to be to rebuilding a robust economy and using those maybe partnerships we haven't used so well in the past to promote childcare.
Great. Well, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you have a chance, check out the chat. There's some great conversation there. And before I pass it back to Lauren, I'll just say thank you so much to all of you for being here. It's such a huge number of people to talk about this issue. And I just want to invite everyone to just join this movement and stand rooted firmly in the movement, that this is a root issue and that it really is time for it to be talked about in a serious way. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Lauren to close this out.
And I will be brief and just say thank you again, Congresswoman Clark, Councilor Campbell. We are so grateful to have had you join us tonight. To everyone on the call, I encourage you to get in touch with their offices. I'm sure that they have staff members on the participant list right now who maybe want to just quickly throw an email or something out there. So if participants are looking to get involved with your offices, they know who to reach out to. And then otherwise, just please stay engaged with Neighborhood Villages. We do invite you to join our movement, get involved with our programs, and we'll be in touch about another conversation like this as we hope to keep them coming. So thank you so much, Congresswoman and Councilor.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you. And thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you all. Good to see you, Andrea.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.